The air inside the rusted 2012 Chevy didn't just smell of old upholstery and stale coffee. It tasted of iron. A sharp metallic tang clung to the roof of Luna's mouth like pennies under a tongue. Outside, the Pacific Northwest didn't just exist, it encroached. The blackwood pines weren't merely trees, they were ancient, jagged sentinels of cedar and Douglas fir that seemed to lean over the asphalt of Route 42, knitting their needle-thick fingers together to choke out the moonlight. The silence here wasn't an absence of noise, it was a physical weight, a pressurized density that made the eardrums ache as if submerged in deep, icy water. Luna could hear the rhythmic thrum of her own pulse, a frantic, uneven beat that felt less like a heart and more like a trapped bird battering its wings against her ribs. She gripped the steering wheel until her knuckles turned the color of bone, the leather beneath her palms damp with a cold, frantic sweat. Every time the headlights flickered, a stuttering, yellowed beam against the overwhelming dark, the shadows between the trunks seemed to reset, repositioning themselves closer to the shoulder of the road. It was the rot that got to her next. Not the sweet decay of fallen leaves, but something chemical, something ancient and wet, like a cellar that hadn't been opened since the turn of the century. It was the smell of things that were never meant to be breathed in by the living, a stagnant vapor that seemed to seep through the vents of her car, coating her lungs in a fine film of dread. Luna's mind was a fracturing mirror, reflecting shards of the life she had left behind in Seattle. She was running from a silence that had started in her own apartment, a quiet that had grown teeth and begun to nibble at the edges of her sanity. But this road, this dark street, as the locals in the last gas station had called it with a hushed, reverent fear, was different. Here, the geography felt wrong. The road should have crested a hill 5 miles ago, yet it remained a flat, agonizingly straight line that vanished into a wall of fog. Her GPS had died an hour ago, the screen glowing a sickly, static-filled white before hissing into a black void. She was alone, caught in the throat of the American wilderness, and the deeper she drove, the more she felt like a morsel being swallowed by a titan. Her internal nausea wasn't just motion sickness, it was an existential vertigo. She felt the sudden, irrational urge to scream, just to see if the sound could penetrate the wall of trees, but the fear that something might scream back kept her throat tight. Her eyes ached from staring into the dark. Then the car began to shudder. It wasn't the engine. The RPMs were steady. It was the sensation of something massive walking nearby, the vibrations traveling through the asphalt and up through the tires. She slowed down, her breath hitching in her throat, her chest tightening until it felt like her lungs were filled with lead. Why was the road so dark? Why did the fog look like smoke? She checked her rearview mirror, and for a split second, she didn't see the empty back seat. She saw a flicker of movement, a distortion in the glass that looked like a face stretched across a balloon, pale and featureless. She gasped, swerving slightly, the tires screeching against the damp pavement. When she looked again, there was nothing but her own wide, dilated pupils and the reflection of the dashboard lights. Her heart was now a hammer, pounding against her sternum. "It's just the exhaustion," her voice sounding thin and alien in the cramped space. "Just the trees playing tricks." But the smell of iron was getting stronger, and now it was mixed with the scent of ozone, the smell of a lightning strike that never came. Suddenly, the car's headlights caught something white on the edge of the road. At first, she thought it was a deer, but as she drew closer, the shape resolved into something far more unsettling. It was a dress, a white, lace-trimmed Sunday dress from an era that didn't belong in the 21st century, hanging from a low branch. It didn't look tattered or dirty. It looked pristine, as if it had just been ironed and placed there for someone to find. As she passed it, the dress didn't sway in the wind, because there was no wind. It hung perfectly still, a jagged hole in the reality of the forest. Luna's foot pressed harder on the gas, but the Chevy seemed to resist, the engine whining in a high-pitched metallic protest. The forest was no longer just a collection of trees. It had become a cathedral of shadows.
Every trunk looked like a limb, every knot in the wood like a weeping eye. She felt the fracturing of her sanity, the thin line between this is happening and I am losing my mind, blurring into a gray smudge. She began to count to keep herself grounded. 1, 2, 3, 4. By the time she reached 50, the road began to curve sharply to the left, a turn that wasn't on any map she had studied. At the apex of the curve, her headlights illuminated a figure standing in the middle of the road. Luna slammed on the brakes, the car skidding, the smell of burnt rubber filling the cabin. She stopped mere inches from the figure. It was a man, or the silhouette of one, wearing a heavy flannel jacket and a hunter's cap. He stood perfectly still, his back to her. "Hey!" Luna shouted, her voice cracking. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" The man didn't move. He didn't seem to be breathing. Luna reached for her door handle, her hand trembling so violently she could barely grip the cold metal. Logic told her to stay in the car, to reverse and drive until the tires fell off. But a strange, hypnotic pull, a curiosity born of pure terror, forced her to crack the door. The moment the seal broke, the sound of the forest flooded in. It wasn't the sound of crickets or wind. It was the sound of thousands of voices, all whispering the same word at a frequency so low it was felt rather than heard.
She froze, her boot hovering over the asphalt. The man in the road slowly began to turn. His movements were jerky, unnatural, like a stop-motion animation. As his face came into the light, Luna realized with a jolt of pure, ice-cold horror that he had no eyes. Where his eyes should have been were two perfectly smooth patches of skin, as if he had been born without them. And yet, he was looking right at her. "The road doesn't go forward anymore, Luna," he said, his voice sounding like dry leaves skittering over a tombstone. "It only goes down." Before she could react, he didn't vanish. He simply stepped into the darkness and became a part of it, his form dissolving into the shadows of the pines as if he were made of smoke. Luna scrambled back into the car, locking the doors with a frantic click, click, click. She threw the car into reverse, but the gear shift wouldn't budge. It was stuck, jammed by an invisible force. She looked out the windshield, and the road ahead had changed. The asphalt was gone. In its place was a trail of white lilies, stretching as far as her lights could reach, glowing with an inner sickly light. She reached for her phone to try and call 911 one last time, even though she knew there was no signal. As the screen lit up, she saw a notification on her lock screen. An audio recording app had been running for the last 40 minutes. With trembling fingers, she hit stop and then play. For the first 30 seconds, there was only the hum of the car. Then a voice, her own voice, began to speak, but she hadn't said these things. On the recording, her voice was reciting a list of names, names of people she didn't know, followed by dates. September 12, 1954, October 3, 1921, November 19, 1888. And then the recording captured a second voice, a wet, slurping sound, followed by a whisper that came from directly behind where her head would have been in the driver's seat. "She's almost home, brothers. The marrow is still warm." Luna dropped the phone into the footwell. She looked in the rearview mirror again. This time, the back seat wasn't empty. There was a hand, pale, elongated, with too many knuckles, resting gently on the headrest of the passenger seat. It wasn't attacking, it was waiting. The realization hit her then, a mid-story revelation that chilled her to the marrow. The car hadn't been moving for the last 10 miles. She had been sitting in the same spot, the forest moving around her like a treadmill of shadows, a cinematic trick played by a predatory landscape. The road was an illusion, a lure to get her deep enough into the Blackwood Pines, where the laws of physics and the mercy of God no longer applied. She wasn't a traveler anymore. She was a guest at a feast,
she hadn't realized was being prepared for her. The engine finally died, and as the lights flickered out, the silence of the American jungle rushed in to claim its prize. The Chevy's engine didn't just sputter, it groaned, a deep mechanical rattle that felt like a death rattle in the throat of a dying beast. Luna's knuckles were bone white against the cracked leather of the steering wheel. The metallic tang in the air, the taste of old pennies and wet iron, had intensified, coating her throat until every breath felt like swallowing sludge. Outside, the blackwood pines were no longer mere vegetation. In the weak, flickering beam of her headlights, the Douglas firs seemed to vibrate, their needle-laden branches reaching out like the skeletal fingers of a drowning giant. The road, a jagged ribbon of asphalt that the locals called the throat of the woods, seemed to be narrowing, the forest canopy knitting together overhead until the moon was nothing but a fractured memory. Luna wiped the condensation from the windshield, but the glass was oily, smeared with a residue that shouldn't have been there. She glanced at the digital clock on the dashboard. 2:14 a.m. It had been 2:14 a.m. for the last 20 minutes. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic rhythmic percussion that matched the erratic thumping of a loose belt under the hood. The nausea she'd felt earlier had evolved into a sharp, localized pain behind her left eye, a pulsing migraine that signaled her sanity was beginning to fray at the edges. She tried to hum a song, something her mother used to sing, but her voice came out as a dry, rasping croak. The silence of the Pacific Northwest was not empty, it was heavy, filled with the weight of centuries of rot and the whispered secrets of things that preferred the dark. She pressed the gas pedal harder, but the Chevy refused to accelerate. It felt as if the car was moving through molasses, the very atmosphere resisting her escape. Then, the first glitch happened. As she rounded a sharp hairpin turn, her headlight swept across a moss-covered mileage marker, mile 42. Luna frowned. She had passed mile 42 10 minutes ago. She remembered the specific way the moss hung off the 4, like a weeping beard. She dismissed it as a trick of the fog, a hallucination born of sleep deprivation and the oppressive gloom. But then she saw the tree. It was a massive, lightning-scarred cedar, its trunk split open like a vertical mouth. Hanging from a low-hanging branch was a scrap of red flannel. Her breath hitched. That was her flannel shirt, the one she had lost at a gas station 300 miles back in Oregon. It hung limp, sodden with the perpetual mist, swaying with a rhythm that didn't match the wind. Panic, cold and sharp as a razor, sliced through her chest. She slammed on the brakes. The Chevy skidded, the tires screaming against the damp pavement before coming to a jarring halt. Luna sat in the sudden, deafening silence, her breath coming in ragged gasps that fogged the windshield. She reached for the door handle, her instinct screaming her to run, but her logic, the thin, crumbling wall of her rational mind, told her that the forest was a predator and the car was her only shell. She looked in the rearview mirror, and the blood drained from her face. In the reflection, the back seat wasn't empty. A pale, translucent shape sat in the shadows of the rear bench. It wasn't a solid figure, but a distortion in the air, like heat rising off a summer highway. It was the shape of a person, head tilted at an impossible neck-snapping angle. Luna didn't scream. Her throat was too tight for sound. She spun around, eyes wide, staring at the empty seat. Nothing, just the scent of wet earth and something sickly sweet, like lilies left too long in a vase. When she turned back to the mirror, the figure was gone, but a handprint was visible on the inside of the rear window, a small, muddy handprint that slowly began to slide down the glass, leaving a brown streak in its wake. She fumbled for the glove box, desperate for her flashlight, her hands shaking so violently she nearly broke the latch. As it fell open, a pile of old Polaroids spilled out onto the floor mat. Luna froze. She didn't own a Polaroid camera. She reached down, picking up the top photo. The image was grainy, the colors bled out into sepia and gray. It showed a woman standing on this exact stretch of road, right in front of the lightning-scarred cedar. The woman's face was blurred, a smear of white features, but she was wearing Luna's denim jacket, the one with the specific tear on the left cuff. Luna looked down at her own arm. The tear was identical. In the background of the photo, just visible in the darkness of the trees, were dozens of pale, lidless eyes staring back. This was the mid-story revelation that shattered her composure. She wasn't just driving through Blackwood Pines, she was being integrated into it. The road wasn't a path to a destination, it was a digestive tract. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. The metallic taste in her mouth, it wasn't iron, it was the taste of her own fear, a chemical reaction to the forest's psychic field. She looked at the GPS again. The screen was no longer showing a map. Instead, it was scrolling a single line of text over and over. You are here because you were always here. A soft thump landed on the roof of the car, then another. It sounded like heavy fruit falling from a tree, or perhaps wet bags of sand. Thump, thump, thump. The Chevy began to rock gently, the suspension groaning under a weight that shouldn't have been there. Luna looked up. The fabric of the car's ceiling began to sag, as if something heavy and amorphous was pressing down from the roof. A dark, viscous liquid began to seep through the seams of the upholstery, dripping onto the center console. It was thick, black, and smelled of the deepest parts of the earth where things go to die. She realized then that the dark street road wasn't a road at all. It was a lure. Every mile she drove brought her deeper into a spatial anomaly that defied the laws of the American landscape she knew. There was no Washington state beyond these trees. There was no Oregon. There was only the Blackwood. The forest was moving again, she was sure of it now. They were closer to the asphalt than they had been seconds ago, their roots humping up through the soil like the spines of great buried things. The asphalt itself was cracking, yielding to the pressure of the growth beneath it. Luna grabbed the gear shift, slamming the car into drive.
She didn't care about the screeching bell to the smoke beginning to curl from under the hood. She floored it. The Chevy roared, its headlights cutting through the gloom as she raced past mile 42 again and again and again. Each time she passed the marker, the red flannel shirt on the branch was higher up, as if the tree was hoisting a trophy. Each time, the handprint on the rear window was joined by another, until the glass was a collage of muddy, desperate palms. She was trapped in a feedback loop of her own escalating terror. The psychological unraveling was near complete. She began to hear voices in the static of the dead radio. Not words, but the sound of her own name being whispered by 1,000 rustling leaves. Luna, Luna, come home. The cold sweat turned into a freezing shiver that racked her entire body. She was losing her sense of self, her memories of life outside the forest fading like old ink in the rain. She looked at her hands on the wheel, and for a split second they looked pale, translucent, just like the figure in the back seat. She screamed then, a raw, primal sound that was swallowed instantly by the moss and the bark. The forest didn't just want her soul, it wanted her history. It wanted to turn her into another ghost story whispered by the few survivors who ever managed to glimpse the edge of the Blackwood and turn back. But Luna couldn't turn back. The road behind her was gone, replaced by a wall of impenetrable timber. The only way was forward, deeper into the dark, toward the shattering truth that lay waiting in the heart of the pines, a truth that was already beginning to take shape in the flickering shadows of her failing mind. The Chevy's engine didn't just die, it surrendered. The final wheezing gasp of the 2012 Malibu echoed through the cathedral of Douglas firs like a gunshot in a tomb, followed by a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight pressing against Luna's eardrums. The dashboard lights flickered, a frantic, rhythmic pulsing of amber and sickly green, before plunging her into an absolute suffocating darkness. The metallic tang of pennies in her mouth had evolved. It was no longer a taste, it was a texture. A thick copper sludge that seemed to coat her esophagus, making every frantic breath feel like she was inhaling liquid iron. Luna sat in the driver's seat, her fingers still fused to the steering wheel, her knuckles white and skeletal. Her heart was a panicked bird trapped in a cage of ribs, drumming a frantic, irregular beat that she could feel in her very teeth. She didn't want to look at the rearview mirror. She knew, with a certainty that transcended logic, that if she looked, the space behind her wouldn't be empty. The presence from the previous miles hadn't stayed on the road. It had seeped through the chassis, a spectral osmosis that had turned the interior of the car into a pressurized chamber of dread. A cold sweat, oily and smelling faintly of ozone and rot, broke across her brow. Her sanity felt like a frayed rope holding back a landslide. "It's just an old car," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp that didn't sound like her own. "It's just the Washington damp. It's just the trees." But the trees were the problem. Through the windshield, the blackwood pines didn't look like flora anymore. In the absence of the headlights, the ancient cedars seemed to lean inward, their gnarled branches reaching out like the desiccated fingers of 1,000 buried giants, clawing at the moonless sky. Luna's hand shook as she reached for the glove box, her fingers fumbling with the latch. She needed the heavy mag light she kept there, anything to pierce the gloom that was now thick enough to touch. The latch clicked open with a sound like a snapping bone. As she reached inside, her fingers didn't find the cool, textured aluminum of the flashlight. Instead, her fingers brushed against something soft, damp, and cold. She recoiled, a sharp yelp escaping her throat, her back slamming against the driver's side door. She fumbled for her phone, the screen's artificial blue light cutting through the dark like a jagged blade. She angled the light toward the open glove box. There was no flashlight. Instead, the compartment was filled with damp, dark soil, the rich black loam of the Olympic jungle floor. And nestled in the center of the dirt was a Polaroid photograph, the edges curled and yellowed with a simulated age. With trembling fingers, Luna reached out and took the photo. The image was clear, too clear. It was a picture of a Chevy, parked exactly where it was now, on this specific bend of Route 12. But in the photograph, the driver's side door was wide open, and the interior was filled with a thick white mist. And there, standing just at the edge of the tree line, was a figure. It was tall, impossibly thin, its proportions stretched like taffy. It wore a dress that looked like it was woven from the very moss and lichen of the forest, and where its face should have been, there was only a smooth, pale void. But the detail that shattered Luna's remaining composure wasn't the figure. It was the date scrawled at the bottom of the photograph in black permanent marker, October 14, 2024. Today was October 13. The revelation hit her like a physical blow, a wave of nausea rolling through her gut. The metallic taste in her mouth flared into a burning sensation. This wasn't just a haunting, it was a predestination. The road wasn't leading her away from her fears. It was circling her toward a fixed point in a timeline she couldn't escape. Her mind began to fracture, the reality of the American wilderness outside merging with a hallucinatory internal landscape. She saw herself from above, a tiny metallic speck on a vein of asphalt, surrounded by a sea of predatory green that was slowly, patiently closing its mouth. Suddenly, the Chevy rocked. It wasn't a gust of wind. The air was dead and stagnant. It was a heavy, deliberate pressure, as if something massive had leaned its weight against the trunk. The rear suspension groaned under the strain. Her breath hitched, her lungs burning as she looked into the rearview mirror, unable to stop herself. At first, she saw nothing but the reflection of her own wide, dilated pupils. Then, the mist began to bleed through the seams of the rear window. It wasn't fog. It was a localized weather system of grief and age. Within the mist, a pair of eyes, not human, but the pale milky white of a fish long dead, stared back at her from the back seat. There was no malevolence in those eyes, only an infinite, starving void. Luna didn't scream. She couldn't. The copper taste in her throat had solidified into a gag. She threw herself out of the car, the humid night air hitting her like a wet shroud. The ground beneath her felt wrong, too soft, too hungry. She began to run, her sneakers slapping against the wet asphalt, the sound echoing off the trees like a mockery. The road ahead stretched into infinity, a dark ribbon of impossible geometry. Every few yards she passed a mile marker. Mile 42, she gasped, her legs screaming. 50 yards later, mile 42. 20 yards later, Mile 42. The forest wasn't letting her move forward. It was a treadmill of shadows. The trees on either side seemed to be moving with her, their trunks shifting position in her peripheral vision. The Pacific Northwest jungle was alive, a singular, massive organism, and she was the irritant it was currently dissolving. She stopped, her chest heaving, the damp cold seeping into her marrow. She looked at her hands and saw they were covered in the same black soil from the glove box. When had she touched the ground? She looked back toward the car. The Chevy was gone. In its place stood a rusted, skeletal frame of a vehicle that looked like it had been sitting in the woods for decades. The tires were rotted away, vines of ivy and blackberry brambles winding through the shattered windows. Luna felt her consciousness slipping, the border between then and now evaporating. She reached into her pocket, searching for her phone, for any tether to the world of glass and steel and logic. Her hand closed around a small, hard object. She pulled it out. It was a silver locket. She had never seen it before in her life. She clicked it open. Inside, on the left, was a picture of her mother, looking exactly as she did the day she disappeared 15 years ago in these very woods. On the right, there was no photo. Instead, there was a small, jagged piece of human bone and a scrap of paper with a single word written in her own handwriting. Finally, the nausea returned, more violent than before. She fell to her knees, the black dirt staining her jeans. The internal monologue that usually guided her, the voice of Luna, the architectural student, the survivor, was being drowned out by a low, guttural humming that seemed to emanate from the roots of the trees themselves. It was a song of iron and earth. She realized then that the metallic taste hadn't been blood or pennies. It was the taste of the soil here. The blackwood pines were rich in hematite, in raw iron ore. The forest was magnetic, pulling at the iron in her own blood, literally trying to drag her into the earth. The ghost wasn't just a spirit, it was the forest's memory of everyone who had ever bled on this road. As she sat there on the cold asphalt, she heard a sound that made her soul shrivel. It was the sound of a car engine, a 2012 Chevy Malibu, sputtering and groaning, approaching from the direction she had just come. The headlights cut through the fog, blinding her. She stood up, waving her arms, a desperate hope surfacing through the terror. "Help!" she screamed. "Over here!" The car slowed, its engine rattling with a familiar terminal cough. It pulled over to the side of the road, right next to the rusted wreck of her own car. The driver's side door opened. Luna froze. Her heart stopped. Stepping out of the car was a woman. She wore the same denim jacket Luna was wearing, the same messy ponytail, the same frantic expression. The woman looked at the rusted wreck, then looked directly at Luna. But in the woman's eyes, Luna wasn't a person. She was just another shadow, another twisted branch in the blackwood pines. Luna tried to speak, but her voice was gone. She looked down at her hands. They were no longer flesh and bone.
They were turning gray, the skin becoming rough and bark-like. The transition was silent and painless, a terrifyingly natural progression. She wasn't being killed, she was being integrated. The Luna who had just stepped out of the car screamed, a sound of pure, unadulterated terror that Luna felt in her own throat, even though she couldn't make a sound. The time loop wasn't just a circle, it was a spiral, tightening with every revolution. "I'm still here," Luna tried to think, but the thought was becoming heavy, metallic. The iron in her blood was settling, anchoring her to the spot. She looked toward the tree line and saw the tall, thin figure from the Polaroid. It was closer now. It held out a hand, and Luna realized with a final, soul-crushing clarity that the figure wasn't a monster, it was a guide, and its face wasn't a void, it was a mirror. As the new Luna fumbled with her phone, the screen's blue light illuminating the damp air, the original Luna felt her feet take root. The asphalt felt like skin. The forest breathed out a sigh of cedar and iron, and for the first time since she entered the blackwood pines, the metallic taste in her mouth became sweet. The silence was not an absence of sound,
It was a predatory presence, a living, breathing entity that had swallowed the dying gasps of the 2012 Chevy whole. Inside the cabin, the darkness didn't just obscure Luna's vision. It felt heavy, like a shroud woven from wet wool and iron filings. The metallic tang she had tasted since crossing the county line had evolved into a full-bodied copper thrum against her teeth, the unmistakable flavor of a slow-bleeding wound. Luna's breath hitched, coming in ragged, shallow bursts that frosted the windshield from the inside. But the frost was wrong. It didn't form in crystalline patterns of nature. It spread like a rash, jagged and sharp, carving out jagged shapes that looked suspiciously like reaching fingers. Her knuckles, white and strained, refused to let go of the steering wheel. To let go was to admit she was no longer in control. To let go was to succumb to the vacuum of the Pacific Northwest night. Outside, the Douglas firs and ancient cedars of Blackwood pines were no longer trees. They were the ribs of a gargantuan, lightless cathedral. The wind didn't howl. It whispered through the needles, a sibilant, overlapping chorus of voices that sounded like her own name being spoken by someone with a mouthful of graveyard soil. She reached for the door handle, her fingers trembling so violently they clattered against the plastic. The mechanism was cold, colder than the Oregon winter should allow. It felt like touching dry ice. She pulled. The door didn't budge. It wasn't locked. It felt fused, as if the Chevy had become a single solid piece of rusted iron, a sarcophagus designed specifically for her. Panic, cold and oily, surged from her stomach to her throat. She slammed her shoulder against the door, the impact vibrating through her bones, but the car remained indifferent. Then the smell hit her. It wasn't the stale coffee or the old upholstery anymore. It was the scent of ozone, burnt rubber, and something sickeningly sweet, the smell of lilies left too long in a vase of stagnant water. In the rearview mirror, a flicker of movement caught her eye. At first, she thought it was a trick of her fracturing mind, a neurological protest against the sensory deprivation. But then the dashboard lights, those sickly green and amber ghosts, gave one final dying pulse. In that split second of illumination, she saw a figure in the back seat. It wasn't a shadow. It was a silhouette of a woman, her head tilted at an angle that suggested a snapped neck, her face a pale blur of weeping lacerations. The image burned into Luna's retinas just before the car plunged back into the abyss. Luna didn't scream. The sound died in her throat, strangled by the sheer weight of her terror. She clawed at the window, her fingernails screeching against the glass, leaving jagged streaks in the frost. "I'm not here," she whispered, her voice a fragile reed in the dark. "I'm driving to Portland. I'm just tired. This is the exhaustion." But the mind can only lie for so long before the reality of the nightmare breaks the skin. A soft, wet sound, like a sponge being squeezed, emanated from the seat behind her. A hand, pale and translucent as parchment, slid over the headrest. The fingers were long, tapering into blackened tips, and as they touched the shoulder of Luna's jacket, she felt a cold so profound it felt like her blood was crystallizing in her veins. Driven by a primal surge of adrenaline, Luna kicked the driver's side window. The glass didn't shatter, it dissolved. It turned into a fine gray powder that smelled of wood ash. She tumbled out of the car, falling onto the asphalt of the dark street road. The ground was slick with a black, viscous moisture that didn't feel like rain. It felt like oil. She scrambled to her feet, her lungs burning as she inhaled the thick, foggy air of the forest. The Chevy sat behind her, a dark hunk of metal that now looked ancient, its tires sunken into the pavement as if it had been sitting there for decades rather than minutes. She began to run. The road stretched out before her, a ribbon of decaying asphalt, flanked by the suffocating wall of the jungle-like pines. The streetlights, relics of a logging era long forgotten, flickered overhead, casting long, strobing shadows that seemed to detach themselves from the trees and follow her. Every few yards, she saw something that defied logic. A child's shoe, pristine and red, sitting in the middle of the lane. A rusted tricycle. A set of keys hanging from a low-hanging branch. These were not random debris. They were milestones of a life she was losing the ability to remember. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird in a cage. "The road has to lead somewhere," she gasped, her legs heavy as if she were running through waist-deep water. But the scenery wasn't changing. The same lightning-scarred cedar, the same moss-covered boulder, the same Route 22 sign passed her again and again. She was trapped in a loop, a topographical Mobius strip designed by a malevolent architect. The psychological unraveling she had feared was no longer a threat. It was a completed process. She was a ghost in her own life, a passenger in a tragedy she couldn't quite recall. Then she saw it. 100 yards ahead, a roadside memorial stood nestled in the ferns. It was a simple wooden cross, adorned with faded plastic flowers and a weather-beaten photograph. Luna slowed, her breath coming in ragged sobs. She didn't want to look. Every fiber of her being screamed her to turn back, to run into the black maw of the forest, rather than face what was on that cross. But her feet moved of their own accord, drawn by a horrific magnetic inevitability. She reached the shrine. The plastic flowers were choked with spider webs, and the wood was rotting. She knelt, the wet gravel biting into her knees. Her hand, trembling and caked in the black oil of the road, reached out to wipe the grime from the photograph. As the mud smeared away, a face stared back at her. It was her face, the same wide amber eyes, the same mole on the left cheek. But the caption beneath the photo didn't bear her name alone. It bore a date, October 14th, 1994. "No," she whimpered, the word tasting of the copper and iron that had haunted her from the beginning. "That was 30 years ago. I'm 30. I wasn't." The realization hit her with the force of a high-speed collision. The metallic taste wasn't blood from a small cut. It was the taste of the car's radiator fluid and her own internal hemorrhaging. The cold wasn't the Oregon night. It was the onset of shock and death. She looked back at the Chevy. It wasn't her Chevy. In the pale, flickering light of the dying street lamps, she saw the truth. It was a mangled wreck of a 1990s sedan wrapped around the trunk of a massive Douglas fir like a piece of discarded tin foil. The metal was rusted orange, the glass long ago shattered into diamonds that littered the forest floor. And inside, still strapped into the driver's seat, was a figure that had been waiting in the dark for 30 decades. The figure she had seen in the rearview mirror wasn't a passenger. It was the memory of her own transition. The forest began to close in. The trees moved, their roots slithering over the asphalt like serpents. The road wasn't just a road, it was a digestive tract, and Luna was the meal. The mid-story reveal wasn't just that she was dead, it was that she had been replaying this final desperate drive for an eternity, unable to cross the threshold because she refused to acknowledge the twisted metal and the smell of lilies. The nightmare wasn't escalating, it was simply repeating, each cycle stripping away another layer of her sanity until only the raw, screaming nerve of the accident remained. She stood up, the black oil now up to her ankles, as the silhouette from the car, her own broken 30-year-old self, began to crawl out of the rusted wreckage toward her.
Its neck snapping with the sound of dry kindling. The silence didn't just break, it hemorrhaged. Luna sat frozen in the driver's seat of the 2012 Chevy Malibu, her lungs burning with the effort of drawing air that felt thick and viscous, like inhaling liquid lead. The metallic tang, the copper, the pennies, the iron, was no longer a suggestion, it was a flood. It coated her tongue, dripped down the back of her throat, and pooled in the hollow of her collarbone. She reached up to wipe her mouth, her fingers trembling with a palsy that originated deep in her marrow, and when she pulled her hand away, it wasn't sweat she saw in the dim, dying amber glow of the dashboard. It was black, glistening oil mixed with something dark and crimson. The dashboard clock didn't tick, it throbbed. 11:59 p.m. It had been 11:59 p.m. for what felt like an eternity. She forced the door open. The hinges didn't creak, they screamed, a high-pitched metallic wail that tore through the predatory quiet of the Washington woods. As her boots hit the asphalt of the dark street, the ground didn't feel solid. It felt like walking on a bruised lung, spongy, yielding, and pulsing with a rhythmic vibration that matched her own frantic heartbeat. The Pacific Northwest night was a sensory deprivation tank. The Douglas firs were no longer trees. They were serrated blades of shadow, cutting the moonlight into jagged, unusable shards. She took one step away from the Chevy, then another, her breath hitching in her chest. Each exhale was a ghost of its own, a plume of white vapor that didn't dissipate but hung in the air, forming the shapes of screaming faces that vanished the moment she blinked. "Just move," she whispered, but the voice wasn't hers. It was a wet, gurgling sound, as if her vocal cords were being played like a harp made of barbed wire. She began to walk down the center of the road, the yellow lines glowing with a sickly, phosphorescent light. The jungle of pines pressed in, the branches reaching out like skeletal fingers to brush against her shoulders. She felt the internal nausea swell, a violent, heaving rejection of reality. Her mind was fracturing, the seams of her sanity splitting under the pressure of a memory she couldn't quite grasp. Why was the road so familiar? Why did the smell of pine needles remind her of a funeral she had never attended? Then she saw it. 100 yards ahead, bathed in the strobe light flicker of a broken street lamp that shouldn't have been there, stood a figure. It was tall, impossibly thin, and draped in the same shadow as the blackwood pines. But as she drew closer, the figure didn't resolve into a person. It was a reflection. A mirror stood in the middle of the road, its frame carved from the same charred cedar as the surrounding forest. Luna stopped, her knees buckling. Her reflection in the glass wasn't Luna, not the Luna who had started this drive. The woman in the mirror had skin the color of wet ash. Her eyes were not hazel. They were two hollow pits filled with the same black oil that was now leaking from the Chevy's engine. And her throat, it was open. A clean, jagged gash ran from ear to ear, revealing the white of her vertebrae and the dark, pulsing cavity of her esophagus. Luna screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the trees. She turned to run, but the road didn't lead back to the car, it led back to the mirror. She ran until her lungs felt like they were filled with broken glass, her boots pounding against the asphalt in a rhythm that sounded like a drum roll for an execution. Every time she turned a corner, the mirror was there. The reflection was closer now. She could see the details of the wound. She could see the way the blood didn't flow, but hung in the air like rubies suspended in gelatin. The metallic taste reached a crescendo, a cacophony of iron that made her teeth ache. She fell to her hands and knees, the rough pavement tearing at her palms, and that's when she saw the glass. Not the mirror glass, but safety glass, small diamond-like cubes of it scattered across the road like frozen tears. She looked to her left, into the dark heart of the pines. There, twisted around the trunk of an ancient, moss-covered Douglas fir, was the Chevy. But it wasn't her Chevy. It was a wreck, a crumpled skeletal remains of a vehicle that had been consumed by the forest years ago. The driver's side was crushed, the steering column driven through the seat like a stake through a heart. And there, slumped over the deflated, blood-stained airbag, was a body. The clothes were the same, the hair was the same, The small silver locket Luna wore around her neck was glinting in the moonlight, resting against the chest of a woman who hadn't breathed in a long, long time. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. The death rattle of the engine wasn't the car dying, it was her own final wheezing gasp. The metallic tang wasn't a premonition, it was the taste of the steering wheel she had bitten through upon impact. The blackwood pines weren't encroaching, they were her tomb. Luna wasn't a traveler on a dark road, she was the road. She was the accident. The flickering dashboard lights were the flash of the state troopers' sirens, forever etched into her retinas in the millisecond before the dark took her. Luna looked back at the mirror in the center of the road, and this time, the reflection stepped out. The dead Luna walked towards the living Luna with a grace that was entirely inhuman. It reached out a hand, fingers dripping with that black, oily sludge, and touched Luna's cheek. The cold was absolute. It wasn't the cold of a Washington winter, it was the cold of the void between stars. "It's time to stop driving, Luna," the entity hissed, its voice the sound of tires screeching on wet pavement. Luna looked down at her hands. They were fading. The solid flesh was becoming translucent, revealing the white bone and the dark veins beneath. The nausea vanished, replaced by a hollow, aching emptiness. Luna looked at the road one last time, the dark street, the jungle of pines, the eternal 11:59 p.m. The foreshadowing of the iron, the engine's surrender, the predatory quiet, it all coalesced into a single terrifying truth. She hadn't been trying to reach a destination, she had been trying to escape the moment of her death. But the blackwood pines don't let anything escape. They keep their ghosts. They weave them into the bark and the needles and the shadows. Luna closed her eyes, and as the last of her consciousness dissolved into the copper-scented air, the clock finally ticked. 12 a.m. The cycle was complete. The Chevy was gone. The road was empty. Only the pines remained, leaning a little closer to the asphalt, waiting for the next set of headlights to pierce the dark.